The 6 guns fired for less than 2 seconds. 80 rounds. The float plane below him broke apart and fell burning into the sea. A clean kill, his 15th of the war. And then silence. Ira Kepford pulled the Corsair out of its dive at 3,000 feet and looked up. He looked up the way a man looks up when he already knows what he is going to see. 20 Japanese fighters, falling out of the clouds at 16,000 feet. They had been there the whole time, running a routine patrol above the overcast. They had not been hunting him. They had not laid a trap. They had simply seen his muzzle flashes when he fired on the float plane. 650 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously produce a light visible for miles in clear tropical air. He had lit himself up like a flare. One Corsair, the airplane the Navy rejected. The airplane the Navy said could not land on a carrier deck. The airplane they gave away because they did not want it. 20 Japanese planes were now diving toward that airplane. And the only advantage it had left was the one thing the Navy had never questioned: speed. But before there was speed, before there was the morning of February the 19th, 1944, before there was a 24-year-old pilot, alone above the Solomon Sea with 20 enemy fighters, shot dropping toward him from the clouds, there was the airplane itself, and it almost never made it to the war. In 1938, the United States Navy issued a requirement for a new carrier-based fighter. Specification called for the fastest single-engine fighter the American aviation industry could produce. The Chance Vought Corporation, working from a small factory complex in Stratford, Connecticut, answered with a design built around a single idea: take the most powerful engine available. Build the smallest possible airframe around it. Accept the consequences. The engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2000, 800 double wasp, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, air-cooled, rated at 2,000 horsepower on takeoff. It was the most powerful production radial engine in the world. The propeller it required was 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter. So large that no conventional landing gear arrangement could keep the blade tips from striking the ground on takeoff. The Vought engineers solved the ground clearance problem by bending the wing. The F4U had an inverted gull wing, a shape that dropped the wing root down close to the fuselage and then angled the outer panels upward. The landing gear sat at the lowest point of the bend, the knuckle of the gull, giving the propeller just enough clearance to spin above the pavement without touching. The result was an airplane unlike anything that had ever flown from a carrier deck. It was fast, over 400 miles per hour in level flight, faster than any other carrier fighter in the world by a margin of 30 miles per hour or more. It was heavily armed. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. At the convergence point set for 300 yards, those 6 streams of fire intersected in a space smaller than a bathtub. Anything that flew through that space came apart. The F4U could climb at better than 3,000 feet per minute. It could dive at speeds that made the wings of most Japanese fighters flutter and fail. And the airframe was built heavy, built strong, built with armor plate behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings. The airplane was designed not just to kill but to survive, to take hits and keep flying, to bring its pilot home. On paper, the F4U Corsair was the finest naval fighter the United States had ever produced. In the air, it was something else entirely. The Navy tested it aboard carriers in the fall of 1942 and the spring of 1943. The results were catastrophic. Pilot after pilot came aboard, lined up on the approach, lost sight of the deck behind the long nose, misjudged the altitude, and hit the deck too hard or too soft or at the wrong angle. The airplanes bounced over the arresting wires and crashed into the barriers. They ground-looped on the wet steel. They departed controlled flight on the approach and went into the water alongside the ship. The accident rate was staggering. The long nose, the enormous engine, the cockpit set far back along the fuselage, all combined to create a forward visibility problem that no amount of engineering could solve. On final approach to a carrier deck, the pilot could not see the landing signal officer until the last seconds. He could not see the deck at all. He was landing blind at 90 knots, trusting a man with 2 paddles standing on a platform at the stern of a ship he could not see. The landing gear was stiff. The oleo struts, designed for the weight of a heavy fighter, bounced badly on carrier steel. A Corsair touching down on a flight deck would hit, bounce, hit again, bounce higher, and if the tailhook did not catch a wire on the first contact, the airplane would go skipping across the deck like a stone on water until it hit the crash barrier or went over the side. Oil leaked from the cowling and streamed backward across the windscreen. One wing had a tendency to stall before the other at low approach speeds. At the moment when the landing signal officer cut the power and the airplane was supposed to drop cleanly onto the deck, the Corsair could snap roll without warning, inverted 50 feet above the ocean at 90 knots. Test pilots, Betnebl Air Station, Anacostia, flew the F4U through its carrier qualification trials aboard escort carriers in the Chesapeake Bay and filed their reports. The language was measured, the conclusion was not. The Corsair was, in their assessment, unsuitable for shipboard operations. The pilots who were sent to learn the airplane at the fleet replacement squadrons gave it a different name. They called it the Ensign Eliminator. The airplane killed more American pilots in training accidents than the Japanese would ever kill in combat. In the spring of 1943, the United States Navy made a decision that was almost unprecedented. It gave up on the fastest fighter it had. Every F4U Corsair was barred from the fleet carriers and reassigned to the United States Marine Corps. The Marines would fly the Corsair from land runways in the Solomon Islands, where the airplane could take off and land on coral strips 1,000 feet long, instead of carrier decks 400 feet long and moving in 3 dimensions. The Navy filled its carrier squadrons with the Grumman F-6F Hellcat instead. The Hellcat was slower than the Corsair by 15 miles per hour. It was less heavily armed, but it could land on a carrier deck without killing its pilot, and in 1943, that was enough. The Corsair was the rejected fighter, the airplane the Navy did not want, the fastest single-engine fighter America had ever produced, and the only one that the service had officially declared unfit for the purpose it was designed to serve. It was not a bad airplane. It was a brilliant airplane that the Navy could not use. The distinction mattered. It meant that somewhere in the Pacific, on some coral runway, far from any aircraft carrier, the Corsair might get a second chance to prove what it could do, if anyone was stubborn enough to give it one. On the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese Navy was flying the airplane that everyone wanted. The Mitsubishi A6M had entered combat over China in 1940 and had immediately rewritten every assumption the Western powers held about Japanese aviation. It was fast. It was maneuverable beyond anything the Allies had encountered. It could fly further than any single-engine fighter in the world, over 1,600 miles on internal fuel. 2 20mm cannons in the wings and 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose gave it firepower that could destroy any Allied aircraft with a short burst. The Americans called it the Zero. The Japanese called it the Type 0 carrier fighter. The name that stuck was the one the world gave it at Pearl Harbor, when Zeros shot down or destroyed nearly every American aircraft in Hawaii. in a single morning. From December of 1941 through the middle of 1942, the Zero was the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific. It outclimbed the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It outturned the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. It outranged every Allied fighter by hundreds of miles. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, at the First and Second Battles of the Solomon Sea, over Darwin, over Burma, over the Dutch East Indies, the Zero swept Allied air opposition out of the sky with a consistency that bordered on the mechanical. Western intelligence officers who studied the wreckage of the first captured Zeros were stunned by the elegance of the design and horrified by the implications. The Zero achieved its extraordinary performance through a design philosophy that was the precise opposite of the Corsairs, where the Corsair was built around a massive engine and heavy structure. The Zero was built around lightness. Its Nakajima Sakai engine produced 1,130 horsepower, barely more than half the power of the Corsair's R2800. But the Zero weighed thousands of pounds less. Its structure was thin. Its pilot sat behind minimal armor. By early 1944, the A6M5 variant carried a CO2 fire extinguisher for the wing fuel tanks, but the tanks were not truly self-sealing. Every bullet that found a fuel line had a reasonable chance of starting a fire that the pilot could not put out. The airplane that conquered the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Midway had been designed for the most skilled naval aviators in the world. It assumed that its pilot would not be hit because his skill and his airplane's agility would keep him out of the enemy's gun sight. It assumed that range and maneuverability mattered more than protection. It assumed that the pilot's hands and eyes were the only armor he would ever need. For the first 18 months of the Pacific War, that assumption held. By early 1944, it was killing the men who flew it. 2 airplanes, 2 design philosophies, one built to survive, one built to fight. The Corsair sacrificed agility for power, speed armor, and the ability to absorb damage and keep flying. The Zero sacrificed everything: weight, protection, structural strength, for the ability to turn tighter, climb faster, and fly further than any opponent it faced. In the conference rooms at Chance Vought and the factory floors at Mitsubishi, these were engineering trade-offs, numbers on specification sheets, stress calculations, and weight budgets. Over the Solomon Sea, on the morning of February the 19th, 1944, they were the difference between living and dying. There was one man in the United States Navy who understood what the Corsair could do if it was given the chance. His name was John Thomas Blackburn. He was 31 years old, born in Annapolis, Maryland. A graduate of the Naval Academy, class of 1933. He was the son of a naval officer and the brother of a naval officer. He had been a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Miami when the war began, desperate to get into the fight, frustrated by months of training duty, while other men flew combat in the Pacific. In late 1942, he had led Composite Squadron VGF-29 during Operation Torch off North Africa, been shot down, and spent 3 days alone in a life raft in the Atlantic before a destroyer fished him out. He had seen the war from a raft in the ocean. He knew what it looked like when everything went wrong. He had formed Fighting Squadron 17 on the 1st of January, 1943, at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia. He had chosen the Corsair as his squadron's aircraft. He had recruited his former flight instructor colleague, Roger Hedrick, as executive officer. He had designed an insignia to match. Because the airplane was called the Corsair, and a Corsair was a pirate, Blackburn chose the skull and crossbones, the Jolly Roger. The name stuck. VF-17 became the Jolly Rogers. Blackburn's pilots earned a reputation at Norfolk that extended well beyond the flight line. They were aggressive, competitive, and not particularly interested in the opinions of anyone outside the squadron. They fought Army pilots in bars. They challenged Marine squadrons to dogfights over the training areas. They flew the Corsair the way Blackburn wanted it flown, which was hard and fast and close to the edge of the airplane's considerable envelope. For 6 months, Blackburn trained his pilots on the F4U. They learned its power. They learned its speed. They learned its killing dive and its violent stall and its tendency to swap ends on a wet runway. They were scheduled to deploy aboard the aircraft carrier, USS Bunker Hill. Then the Navy changed its mind. The Bureau of Aeronautics informed Blackburn that VF-17 would swap its Corsairs for Grumman Hellcats before deployment. Standard procedure. The Corsair was off the carriers. The Hellcat was on. No exceptions. Blackburn refused. He argued. He appealed. He pointed out that his pilots had spent 6 months learning the Corsair's handling, its fuel management, its combat envelope. Swapping to a new aircraft weeks before deployment would cost training time, cost proficiency, and cost the Navy the investment it had already made in VF-17. He negotiated, he pushed, he made himself, in the words of the Navy bureaucracy, difficult. In the end, he won a compromise that would shape the war in the South Pacific. F-17 would keep its Corsairs. It would not deploy aboard Bunker Hill. It would deploy to a coral airstrip in the Western Solomon Islands and fly land-based fighter missions in support of the campaign against the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. It would become the only United States Navy fighter squadron in the entire Pacific War to fly the Corsair from a shore base instead of a carrier deck. That single stubborn compromise was the reason a 24-year-old pilot named Ira Cassius Kepford was sitting in the cockpit of an F4U Corsair on the morning of February the 19th, 1944. Kepford had been born on the 29th of May, 1919, in Harvey, Illinois, a working-class suburb south of Chicago. He had played halfback for the Northwestern University Wildcats. He was fast, physical, and, according to the men who played alongside him, difficult to bring down once he got moving. He was also quiet, not shy, just quiet, the kind of man who did not waste words on things he could demonstrate with action. On Saturday, the 22nd of November, 1941, at the halftime of the Illinois Northwestern football game, with 47,000 spectators watching from the stands, Kepford walked to a table on the sideline and signed his enlistment papers into the United States Naval Aviation Reserve. It was a public ceremony, organized by the Navy as a recruiting event. Kepford was one of several athletes who signed that afternoon. None of them knew that in 15 days, the world they were signing up to defend would change completely. 15 days later, Japanese naval aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. Kepford was already on his way. He earned his wings on the 5th of November, 1942, at Corpus Christi and Miami. His first operational assignment was to VF-17, to John Thomas Blackburn, to the Jolly Rogers, to the rejected airplane on the Coral runway. His brother Harry joined the army. He would earn the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star on a different battlefield. 2 brothers, 2 branches, 2 wars within the same war. Neither of them knew. On the morning Ike Kepford strapped into a Corsair for the first time, that the airplane the Navy did not want would carry him further than either of them could have imagined. VF-17 deployed to the Solomon Islands in late October of 1943. First to Ondonga, a strip cut into a coconut plantation on the island of New Georgia. Then, in January of 1944, forward to Piva Yoke, a fighter strip inland of Cape Torokina on Bougainville, closer to the target, closer to the enemy. Their target was Rabaul, Rabaul was not a town. Rabaul was a fortress. It sat on the northeastern tip of New Britain, ringed by active volcanic cones that rose out of the jungle in steep grey walls, their summits trailing thin lines of sulphur smoke into the tropical sky. Below the volcanoes, the town spread along the shore of one of the finest natural harbors in the Western Pacific, Simpson Harbor, deep enough for heavy cruisers, protected on three sides by high ground, connected by sea lanes to every major Japanese base in the southwestern Pacific. From Simpson Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had projected power across the Solomon Sea, the Bismarck Sea, and the Coral Sea for 2 years. In February of 1944, Rabaul was the most heavily defended Japanese position anywhere in the Pacific south of the home islands. The garrison numbered nearly 100,000 men. The anti-aircraft defenses were among the densest in the theater. Every approach corridor was covered by overlapping fields of fire from positions dug into the volcanic rock above the harbor. Around Rabaul, the Japanese had built 5 airfields: Vunakanau, Lakanai, Rapopo, Tabera, Keravat. From those airfields flew hundreds of aircraft: 0 fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Oscar fighters of the Imperial Japanese Army, Betty bombers, Kate torpedo planes, Val dive bombers. American intelligence estimated that Rabaul held between 250 and 300 serviceable combat aircraft at the peak of the campaign. The Allied strategy was not to invade Rabaul. The cost of a ground assault against a garrison of nearly 100,000 Japanese troops dug into volcanic rock was a price no Allied commander was willing to pay. The strategy was strangulation. Every day, waves of American aircraft, joined by Royal New Zealand Air Force P-40 Warhawks and Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, flew north across the Solomon Sea to hammer the Japanese airfields, the harbor installations, the anti-aircraft positions, and the supply dumps. Day after day, week after week, Marine Air Group 14, Marine Air Group 24, the 13th Air Force of the United States Army Air Forces, Marine Fighting Squadrons 214 and 215, Fighting Squadron 17 of the Navy, all of them working together in a sustained act of collective attrition, designed to grind Rabaul's air power down to nothing. No single squadron carried the campaign. No single pilot carried it. The cost was shared across thousands of American and Allied airmen. Some of them died on the coral runways they had just taken off from. Some died in the water. Some died in the jungle canopy. Many of them are still there. On November the 8th, 1943, Roger Hedrick, the executive officer of VF-17, led a flight of 6 Corsairs into a wall of 39 Japanese fighters over Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. The Japanese were Zeros, the experienced kind, the kind that had been killing Wildcats and P-40s for 2 years. Hedrick's Corsairs were outnumbered more than 6 to 1. VF-17 shot and 3, damaged 4 more, lost nobody. The squadron had been in combat for 1 week. 3 days later, on November the 11th, 1943, the Japanese answered with everything they had. The morning had started as a routine combat air patrol over Task Force 50.3, Frederick Sherman's carrier group operating in Empress Augusta Bay. VF-17 was flying top cover for the carriers while they launched and recovered strike aircraft hitting Rabaul. Blackburn had his Corsairs spread across 3,000 feet of altitude, eyes on the horizon, waiting. The Japanese counterattack came from the north in a massed wave. Upwards of 110 aircraft, Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers in loose formations of 3, nosing over into their attack dives from 10,000 feet. Nakajima B-5 Kate torpedo bombers coming in low and fast at wave top height, aiming for the hulls of the carriers. Zero escorts flying above and to the sides, covering the strike aircraft, watching for American fighters. They had followed Sherman's returning strike aircraft back toward the carriers. It was a tactic the Japanese had used before and would use again. Follow the Americans home. Let them lead you to the fleet. Then attack the ships while their own aircraft were still in the landing pattern. Low on fuel, low on ammunition, unable to fight. VF-17 was outnumbered approximately 3-1. Blackburn's Corsairs were the only barrier between the Japanese strike force and the American carriers below. If VF-17 failed, the Kates would get their torpedo runs. If the Kates got their torpedo runs, American ships would burn. In the engagement that followed, the squadron shot down 18 Japanese aircraft. They suffered 3 damaged planes and 1 injured pilot. They did not lose a single Corsair, not one. Ike Kepford was in the middle of it. He had been flying cover in Roger Hedrick's flight when the Kates appeared below, running their torpedo approaches against the carriers. Kepford rolled into a dive and went after them. He destroyed 3 Val dive bombers in rapid succession, then caught a Kate torpedo plane on its approach run. The Kate was barely 1,000 yards from USS Bunker Hill, the same carrier that VF-17 had been pulled from 2 months earlier. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners were firing at everything in the sky. American planes, Japanese planes, it did not matter. The sky was full of tracers and smoke and burning aircraft, and the gunners were shooting at anything with wings. Kepford flew through Bunker Hill's own anti-aircraft fire to make the kill. The Kate went into the water short of its torpedo release point. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single engagement. The Navy Cross. But Kepford did not receive the Navy Cross because he was brave. He received it because the Corsairs let him do things that no other American fighter in the South Pacific could do at that moment. The doctrine VF-17 perfected over those first weeks was simple, and it had been paid for in blood. Never turn with a zero. Never enter a sustained fight at medium speed. Use the Corsair's speed and dive performance. Come down fast, hit hard, pull away, climb back up, and do it again. Boom and zoom. Energy fighting. If a Zero's cannon shells found you, the armor plate self-sealing tanks gave you a chance to get home. The Zero's pilot had no such margin. The tactics played to every strength the Corsair had, and negated every advantage the Zero carried. VF-17's first combat tour ended on November the 29th, 1943. In 29 days, the squadron had claimed 47 Japanese aircraft destroyed. According to Lee Cook's authoritative history of the squadron, captured Japanese communications from the Rabaul garrison referred to VF-17's attacks in terms that were not flattering. The Japanese fighter pilots who faced the Jolly Rogers called them wolves. The wolf pack stood down from combat operations in early December. They came back in late January 1944, this time to Piva Yoke on Bougainville, closer to Rabaul, closer to the Japanese. And the Japanese they found waiting at Rabaul in January of 1944 were not the same Japanese they had fought in November. The veteran pilots were dying, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, in the kind of grinding attrition that no training system could keep pace with. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. By early 1944, the losses accumulated over 2 years of continuous combat had hollowed out the experienced corps. The men now arriving at Rabaul as replacements had fewer flight hours, less gunnery practice, and almost no formation combat experience. They were being fed into the same Zero cockpits that the veterans had flown, but they were not the same pilots. The Zero itself was part of the problem. The A6M5 The model most common at Rabaul in early 44 was faster than the original and carried some improvements, but the fundamental design philosophy had not changed. The airplane was still built around the principle of range and agility at the expense of protection. Every burst of 50 caliber fire that hit a zero had a reasonable chance of setting it on fire or killing the pilot outright. The Corsair was heavy. It paid for that weight in agility, but that weight was armor and structure and self-sealing fuel cells. And in the skies over Rabaul, it was the difference between a pilot who limped home and a pilot who did not come home at all. Two philosophies, one designed to fight, one designed to survive. In January of 1944, both were about to be tested to destruction. The second tour began on January the 26th. The next 4 days became the most intense period of aerial combat in VF-17's history. On January the 27th, 15 Corsairs of VF-17 escorted a strike package of SBD Dauntless dive bombers against Lakanai Airdrome at Rabaul. The strike group encountered approximately 60 Japanese aircraft over the target area. Fighters, interceptors, everything the Japanese garrison could put in the air. Kepford shot down 2 enemy fighters over the harbor approaches. By the time the engagement ended, his total had crossed the threshold of 5 confirmed aerial victories that made a pilot an ace. He was now among the youngest aces in VF-17. That evening, back at Piva Yoke, while the pilots were filling out their after-action reports and the ground crews were counting holes in the aircraft, the duty officer updated the squadron's status board. One name was not on it. Thaddeus Bell, call sign Juggy, missing in action. Bell had gone into the fight over Lakunai with the rest of the squadron. He had not come out. No radio call, no distress signal, no parachute sighting. He was simply gone. The ocean between Bougainville and Rabaul kept its secrets well. The water was deep and warm and dark, and it did not give back what it took. Kepford made ace on the same day that Bell disappeared. Nobody in VF-17 talked about the coincidence. There was nothing to say. That was how it worked. One man scored. Another man vanished. The mission board went up the next morning with new assignments, and everyone who could still fly went back to Rabaul. January the 28th. Another escort to Rabaul, another sky full of Japanese interceptors climbing to meet them. Kepford's kill count continued to climb. His name was appearing in the daily action reports of Commander Aircraft Solomons. January the 29th. The mission was another escort to Rabaul. Kepford was flying with his wingman, Howard Burris. Everyone in the squadron called Burris by his nickname, Teeth. He had earned it with a grin that showed up in every photograph, and a flying style that was as aggressive as anything in the South Pacific. Over Rabaul that day, Kepford and Teeth Burris found themselves in the middle of a formation of 12 Japanese fighters, 12 against 2. The numbers were suicidal by any rational calculation. 2 Corsairs, alone, outnumbered 6 to 1, with no support and no altitude advantage. The 2 Corsairs went to work. They fought as a pair, covering each other, calling out threats, taking turns diving through the Japanese formation and climbing back up for another pass. The Japanese fighters scattered, reformed, scattered again. The engagement lasted minutes. When it was over, Kepford was credited with 4 kills. Burris was credited with 4 kills. 8 Japanese fighters destroyed by 2 Corsairs in a single engagement. It was the kind of mission that produced award citations and congratulatory messages from higher headquarters. That evening, back at Piva Yoke, the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 17 walked into the ready room. Tom Blackburn was not smiling. He looked at Kepford, he looked at Burris, and he dressed them down. Reckless, overconfident, taking unnecessary risks. Blackburn's words were blunt and they were specific. 2 Corsairs engaging 12 enemy fighters was not a tactic. It was a gamble. A gamble that had worked today, but would not work forever. The odds would catch up. They always did. Kepford listened. Burris listened. Neither man argued. Blackburn was the commanding officer, and Blackburn had more combat experience than anyone in the room. He had been shot down himself, spent 3 days in a life raft off North Africa during Operation Torch before a destroyer picked him up. He knew what it felt like when the odds turned. The warning was delivered. The warning was heard. It did not change anything. Another mission, another escort to Rabble, another sky full of Japanese interceptors. Kepford engaged again. 2 more enemy aircraft fell to the 650 caliber Brownings of his Corsair. His total on the airframe he was flying, Bureau number 17684, side number 29, white 29, now stood at 13 confirmed kills. 13 small Japanese flags painted in a neat row below the cockpit rail. But this time the Japanese hit back. During a head-on pass against a Japanese fighter, both pilots fired simultaneously. At combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, the engagement lasted a fraction of a second. The Japanese pilot's rounds struck Kepford's Corsair in the engine cowling and the forward fuselage, punching through the thin aluminum skin and severing hydraulic lines behind high wall. The enemy aircraft fell away burning. Kepford's Corsair kept flying, but on the instrument panel, the hydraulic pressure gauge was moving. The needle was dropping, falling steadily towards zero. Without hydraulic pressure, the landing gear could not exit normally. Without hydraulic pressure, the flaps could not deploy. Without hydraulic pressure, Kepford had no brakes on the ground. He turned south. He nursed the Corsair back across the Solomon Sea, losing systems one at a time as the hydraulic fluid drained out through the bullet holes. When he reached Piva Yoke, he tried the landing gear handle. One main gear leg extended and locked. The other did not. Kepford brought the Corsair in on one main wheel and the tail wheel. The airplane touched down on the coral strip, held for a moment, and then the unsupported wing dropped. The wingtip caught the ground. The Corsair slewed sideways, spun and ground, looped to a stop in a cloud of coral dust and engine oil. The propeller bent against the coral. The right wing crumpled at the root. The fuselage twisted at the firewall, with a sound like a ship running aground. Bureau number 17684 would never fly again. The crash crew was there in seconds. They found Kepford climbing out of the cockpit under his own power. No blood, no broken bones, no injury that would keep him off the flight's schedule the next morning. He stepped down from the wing root onto the crushed coral and stood there for a moment, looking at the Corsair he had flown for 3 months, the airplane that had carried him through 13 kills, the machine that he had trusted at 400 miles per hour in a dive against Japanese fighters sipped over Simpson Harbor. 13 kill marks on the fuselage, 13 small Japanese flags painted in a neat row below the cockpit rail, all of it now reduced to scrap metal, on a runway 9,000 miles from the factory in Stratford, Connecticut, where it had been built. The Corsair had taken hits that would have killed the pilot of a Zero outright. The armor plate behind the seat had done its job. The self-sealing tanks had held. The engine had kept running long enough to bring him home. The airplane had absorbed everything the Japanese could throw at it, and had still carried him back to the ground alive. Kepford walked away white 29 without a scratch. The airplane did not. The next day, January the 31st, 1944, Howard Burris did not walk away. Teeth Burris was killed in action over Rabaul. 2 days after he and Kepford had together destroyed 8 Japanese fighters in a single engagement. 2 days after, Blackburn had stood in the ready room and told them both that they were taking too many risks. Burris had been flying a Corsair, the same type of airplane, the same armor plate, the same self-sealing tanks, the same engine, the same guns, the same philosophy that had saved Kepford 24 hours earlier. It had not saved Burris. The Corsair gave its pilot a chance, a better chance than the Zero gave its pilot, a better chance than almost any single-engine fighter in the Pacific gave its pilot. But a chance was not a guarantee. There was no armor thick enough, no fuel tank sealed enough, no engine tough enough to stop every bullet, absorb every cannon shell, survive every angle of attack. Blackburn had been right. The odds caught up. They always did. Nobody in VF-17 recorded what Kepford said when he learned that Burris was dead. The after-action reports from January the 31st contain the operational facts. Aircraft lost, pilot killed, mission results. Nothing else. The paperwork of war did not leave room for what a man felt when the pilot who had flown on his wing 2 days earlier was now a name on a casualty list. Kepford was assigned a new Corsair. It carried the same side number, 29, white 29, a different airplane, a different bureau number, but the same 3 digits painted on the fuselage. By early February, after one more confirmed kill on the 3rd of the month, the count stood at 14. The days between the 3rd and the 19th of February were operationally quiet for Kepford. Rabaul was still there. The Japanese garrison was still fighting. But the air opposition was thinning. The weeks of sustained attrition were doing exactly what the Allied strategy had intended. Fewer Japanese fighters were climbing to intercept. The harbor was filling with wrecked ships. The runways were cratered and cratered again. The Japanese pilots who remained at Rabaul in mid-February were the last of the garrison's air defense. Within days, the decision would be made to withdraw all remaining Japanese air units from Rabaul entirely. The fortress that had projected Japanese air power across 3 seas for 2 years was about to go silent. Nobody in VF-17 knew that yet. On the morning of February the 19th, the mission board at Yoke listed a standard escort assignment. Corsairs of VF-17 would provide fighter cover for a formation of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, striking targets in the Rabaul area. Standard route, standard altitude, standard formation. Kepford was assigned to fly high cover with a wingman. The Corsairs lifted off the coral strip at Yoke in the early morning. 20 aircraft. The formation climbed to altitude and turned north across the Solomon Sea toward Rabaul. The mission went according to plan. The bombers reached the target area. The Corsairs held station above. The Japanese response was light. On the return flight, Kepford's wingman called on the squadron frequency. He was losing oil pressure. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 was the most powerful production radial engine in the world. It was also, in the salt air and coral dust of the Solomons, one of the most temperamental. The cylinder heads ran hot. The oil coolers clogged. The accessory drive seals hardened and cracked in 6 months, instead of 18. Ground crews at Yoke worked 18-hour days, pulling cowlings, cleaning filters, replacing gaskets. Sometimes the repairs held, sometimes they did not. This morning they had not held. The wingman needed to return to base before the engine seized. Kepford acknowledged. Standard procedure would have supported both aircraft returning together. A lone fighter, high above the Solomon Sea, was more of a target than a shield. A lone fighter with no wingman had no one watching his blind spots, no one calling out threats from above and behind, no one to cover his tail if a fight developed. Every American fighter pilot in the Pacific knew the rule: do not fly alone. The doctrine was absolute. The doctrine existed because men who flew alone over the Solomon Sea tended not to come back. Kepford did not turn back. What he was thinking in that moment was not preserved in any written source. He never explained the decision in the debriefings or interviews that came later. Perhaps he calculated that the mission was nearly complete and the risk was low. Perhaps he simply did not want to leave the formation uncovered. Perhaps it was the same impulse that had led Blackburn to warn him about overconfidence 3 weeks earlier. The wingman banked southeast and descended toward Bougainville. In 3 minutes, he was a speck against the haze on the southern horizon. In 5, he was gone. Kepford was alone, 15,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. The sky ahead was full of tropical cumulus, big white towers of cloud casting long, dark shadows on the water below. The escort assignment was complete. He was returning to base. The other 17 Corsairs of the morning's mission were somewhere ahead or already turning for home. He had no visual contact with any of them. Over the coastal waters north of Cape St. George, the southernmost point of New Ireland, Kepford saw something moving on the water below. He was at 15,500 feet. Below him and to the right, at roughly 1,000 feet above the sea, a single-engine floatplane was cruising north at low speed. He recognized the silhouette immediately, a Nakajima A6M2N. The Americans called it the Roof, a Zero fighter modified with a large central pontoon float and 2 small outrigger floats under the wings. Converted for use from coastal seaplane bases where no runway existed. Slower than a standard Zero, less maneuverable. Still armed with 2 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns. Against a Corsair diving from 14,000 feet above, the Roof had no chance at all. The Japanese pilot appeared to be flying a coastal patrol. Scanning the water below, he was not looking up. Kepford rolled White 29 into a dive. The airspeed built quickly. At 600 yards, he placed the Pipper on the floatplane's engine cowling. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns of 4,800 rounds per minute. 80 rounds every second. At the convergence point set for 300 yards, all 6 streams of fire intersected in a space smaller than a bathtub. The Roof flew into that space. The engine cowling came apart. The propeller stopped. The floatplane rolled slowly onto back and fell the last 1,000 feet into the ocean. A small white splash. A dark oil slick spreading in a circle. Nothing else. Kill number 15. Kepford pulled White 29 out of the dive at 3,000 feet. He checked the clock on the instrument panel. He checked his fuel state. He checked his heading south. Then he looked up. There is a moment in a fighter pilot's career, if he survives long enough to have one, when the entire logic of his situation reverses in a single heartbeat. 1 second he is the hunter. The next second he is the prey. The sky has not changed. The airplane has not changed. But the meaning of everything around him has inverted completely, and there is a cold, flat instant when the mind processes this reversal before the body has time to react. Kepford had that moment at 3,000 feet above the Solomon Sea on the morning of February the 10th, 1944. Coming down from the cloud layer at 16,000 feet, spread across nearly a mile of sky, were 20 Japanese fighters. He counted them. Then he counted them again because the first number could not be right. 20. They had been there the entire time. A routine combat air patrol holding station in the cloud base over the Rabaul approach corridor. They had not been hunting Kepford. They had not laid a trap. They had simply been running their patrol above the overcast, and the muzzle flashes of 650 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously, had been the only thing that told them an American aircraft was below. The Corsair's greatest weapon had just betrayed its pilot's position to 20 enemy fighters. He had shot the float plane down cleanly, and in doing it, he had lit himself up like a signal flare in front of an entire Japanese combat air patrol. 20 Mitsubishi A6M fighters, the type the Allies called Zeke. Two 20mm cannons in the wings, two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose, maneuverable at medium altitudes in a way that nothing the Americans flew could match in a turning fight. 4 of the Zekes broke away from the main formation and rolled into a dive. They were coming for him. 3,000 feet was the worst possible altitude to be caught at. Too low to climb into a position of advantage, too high to hide against the water. The 4 Zekes had 13,000 feet of altitude above him. Every foot of that altitude was potential energy converting into speed. The other 16 Zekes held station above, watching. 1 Corsair, 1 pilot, 150 miles from Yoke, 20 Japanese fighters between him and the empty sky. The engineering choices made in Stratford, Connecticut, and on factory floors in Nagoya, the rivets and the wing spars and the fuel lines and the gun sights, all of it was about to be tested in the most unequal terms imaginable. 1 against 20, the rejected airplane against the legendary one. Kepford turned to run. He did not think about it. He did not weigh options. He did not consider engaging. The mathematics of the situation were absolute. 1 fighter at 3,000 feet, with no altitude advantage, no speed advantage, and no element of surprise does not engage 20 enemy aircraft. It runs, if it can. He shoved the throttle to the firewall and dropped the nose toward the water. South, away from Cape St. George, away from the 4 Zekes now in their dive, away from the 16 more holding station in the cloud base above, watching, waiting to see which way he would go. South toward Bougainville and Yoke, and a coral runway, and a plane captain sitting on a fuel drum in the morning sun, and 150 miles of empty ocean between here and there. The Corsair began to accelerate. The airspeed indicator climbed. 280, 300, 320, 340. The R2000, 800, was at maximum continuous power, 18 cylinders screaming, the manifold pressure needle pressing against its normal operating limit. The cylinder head temperature climbing into the upper green band. Behind him, the 4 Zekes were converting 13,000 feet of altitude into speed. A diving fighter gains energy faster than a level fighter can build it. It does not matter what engine you have. Gravity does not care about horsepower. Kepford watched the airspeed climb past 340. He checked his rearview mirror. The lead Zeke was at roughly 500 yards, slightly above. Closing. The other 3 were spread in a loose echelon behind, and to both sides, blocking any turn he might attempt. They were herding him, running him straight into open ocean where there was nowhere to hide and no one to help. The first tracers came over the greenhouse. They arrived high and fast, streaking past the canopy in bright white lines that bent toward the water ahead and vanished. A long burst from too far out. The 20mm cannon shells had an effective range of roughly 600 yards. The Japanese pilot had fired at closer to 800. He was reaching, testing. The next burst would not be from 800 yards. Kepford had perhaps 15 seconds before the lead Zeke reached firing convergence. He reached for the landing gear handle and pulled it down. Then he reached for the flap lever and pulled that too. The F4U Corsair's main landing gear could be extended in flight as a dive brake. The pilot's manual documented the system. What the manual also documented were the speed limitations. There was a maximum speed for extension. Kepford was beyond those numbers. The gear doors opened into the slipstream. The main legs began to extend into air, moving past the aircraft at a velocity the engineers at Chance Vought had never intended them to meet. The flap panels dropped. 10 degrees, 20, 30. The Corsair decelerated as if it had been caught by a cable. The airspeed unwound. 340, 300, 260, 220. The force threw Kepford forward into his harness straps. Everything in the cockpit that was not strapped down shifted. The engine noise changed pitch as the propeller pulled against a wall of drag that had not existed 2 seconds ago. Behind him, the lead Zeke had been closing at over 300 miles per hour. In the space of those 2 seconds, the target stopped pulling away. The target nearly stopped entirely. The Japanese pilot could not slow down. The Zero had no dive brakes, no speed brakes of any kind. The only way to bleed airspeed was to pull up and trade speed for altitude, but pulling up would mean losing sight of the target, or he could roll into a turn, but any turn would open the distance and waste the pursuit. The Zeke came through. It passed Kepford's canopy close enough that Kepford could see the green paint on the cowling and the dark silhouette of the pilot's helmet, turning sharply. The Zero blew past the Corsair and appeared ahead of it, decelerating, exposed. Kepford yanked the gear handle up. He yanked the flap lever. The gear retracted. The flaps came up. The airspeed began to build again. The lead Zeke was now ahead of him, less than 200 yards. Silhouetted against the water, turning, Kepford pressed the trigger. The 650 caliber Brownings fired. For approximately 1.5 seconds, at 200 yards, 6 streams of tracer converged into a single point. The rounds entered the Zeke from behind, through the tail, along the spine of the fuselage, into the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The rudder separated. The Zeke rolled slowly onto its left side, dropped the nose, and went into the water at a shallow angle. A brief, white curtain of spray that hung in the air for 3 seconds and then collapsed. Kill number 16. It would be the last kill Ira Kepford would ever score. The maneuver had worked, but it had worked exactly once, and the 3 surviving Zekis had watched it happen from 3 different angles. They had seen their leader die. They would not make the same mistake. The cost was everything Kepford had left. His airspeed was down around 200 miles per hour. His altitude was barely 2,000 feet. The Corsair was flying, but it was flying slow and low and exposed. A heavy fighter without energy, in husk full of lighter fighters that had just watched their flight leader die. He had traded every advantage the Corsair still held: speed, altitude, initiative, for a single firing solution that lasted less than 2 seconds. The maneuver could not be repeated. The 3 surviving Zekes had seen it from behind and to both sides. They had watched the gear come down. They had watched their leader overshoot. They had watched the tracers walk through the cockpit and the airplane roll and fall. They knew exactly what the American had done, and they would not give him the chance to do it again. The 3 remaining Zekes adjusted. They spread wider. They staggered their altitude. They slowed their closure rate. They were closing methodically, covering each other, giving Kepford no angle to exploit and no trick to repeat. Kepford shoved the throttle to the stop. The Corsair began to accelerate again. 220, 240, 260. It was not fast enough. The 3 Zekes were still gaining. Slowly, but closing is closing, and 150 miles is a long way home. His right hand left the stick. His gloved fingers found a lever on the throttle quadrant. The lever controlled the water injection system. War emergency power. The F4U Corsairs of VF-17 had been fitted with the Pratt & Whitney R2000 800A2 engine, the variant equipped with anti-detonation injection. The rated duration at full power was 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, the cylinder head temperatures would exceed safe limits and the engine would begin to destroy itself. Kepford pushed the lever forward. Behind the firewall of Y-29, a small brass nozzle opened in the induction manifold. A pressurized stream of distilled water and methanol sprayed into the supercharger intake, hit the hot, compressed fuel air charge, and flashed instantly into vapor. The temperature of the mixture entering the cylinders dropped. The density of the charge rose. The detonation limit of the engine climbed. The manifold pressure gauge, which had been holding at the normal maximum, rose past it and kept rising. The R2800 went from approximately 2,000 horsepower to approximately 2,250 in 3 seconds. The sound of the engine changed. The vibration through the airframe shifted. The propeller bit deeper into the thick tropical air. The Corsair leapt forward as if something behind it had cut a rope. The airspeed indicator began climbing fast. 280, 300, 320, 340, 360, and still climbing. The airplane that had been struggling to hold distance was now pulling away. The Zeeks could not follow. The Nakajima Sakai engine that powered every model of the Zero produced 1,130 horsepower at its maximum rating. It had no water injection, no emergency reserve of power. The engine had been designed for range and lightness, not for raw power. The Zero's advantage had always been its ability to turn, not its ability to run. In a stern chase at low altitude, when the target could sustain over 400 miles per hour, the Zero had no answer. The distance began to open. 500 yards, 600, 1,000. The lead Zeke fired a long burst. The shells fell into the water behind the Corsair. The second Zeke fired. The tracers went nowhere near. The third Zeke tried something else. The Japanese pilot on the outside of the formation rolled left and dropped into a descending turn. He was attempting an interception, the oldest tactic in fighter aviation. Do not chase the target where it is. Predict where it will be. Aim for a point in space ahead where the lines will cross. The maneuver required a high-angle bank, turn at high speed, at an altitude where there was no margin for error. The Mitsubishi A6M carried a characteristic documented in Allied technical intelligence reports since the middle of the war. At high speeds and high angles of bank, the aileron control forces increased dramatically. The stick force required to hold a turn could spike to nearly 40 pounds. If the pilot forced through the resistance, the wing could depart controlled flight, an uncommanded snap roll. At 10,000 feet, a snap roll was recoverable. At 200 feet, it was a death sentence. The Japanese pilot saw the Corsair passing through his gun sight picture, roughly 200 feet above the waves. He rolled hard. He pulled the stick back. The Zeke's bank angle passed 70 degrees. The ailerons stiffened. He pushed harder. He needed 3 more seconds of turn. The airplane snapped. The Zero flipped inverted in a fraction of a second. The ocean was 200 feet below. The speed was 300 miles per hour. There was no time to recognize the departure, no time to release the stick, no time for anything. Zeke hit the water nose first. The fuselage broke apart on impact. A brief white plume of spray rose from the surface and hung in the morning air. An oil slick spread in a dark circle. Within a minute, there was nothing left. Kepford did not see it. He was watching the 2 remaining Zeeks in his rearview mirror. He watched them fall back. 800 yards, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500. At approximately 4 minutes of water injection use, against the manufacturer's rated maximum of 5, the 2 remaining Japanese pilots abandoned the pursuit. They had been chasing for minutes without closing the distance. Their ammunition was low. Their fuel was burning. The American Corsair was pulling away at a rate that made further pursuit pointless. The two Zekis banked away to the north in a gentle coordinated turn and headed back toward Rabaul, back toward the airfields that would, within days, be emptied of every operational aircraft the Japanese Navy had left in the South Pacific. The pilots who flew those two Zeros back to Rabaul that morning flew into an ending they could not yet see. The fortress was dying. The air campaign was almost over. Within weeks, every surviving Japanese aircraft at Rabaul would be withdrawn or destroyed on the ground, and the skies that had been filled with Zeros for 2 years would fall silent. Kepford watched them go. He watched the two dark specks grow smaller against the blue sky to the north. He waited until they were barely visible. Then he waited until they were gone entirely. He eased the water injection lever to the off position. The manifold pressure dropped. The engine notes softened. The airspeed settled back to cruise. He pulled the throttle back to the long-range setting that would stretch his fuel across the remaining distance to Bougainville. He climbed to 5,000 feet. The sky above him was empty. The ocean below him was empty. The morning was still clear. He was alone. The flight from the waters off Cape St. George to Pioque took 38 minutes. He did not speak on the radio during the transit. There was nothing to report and no one to report it to. He landed at 9:07 in the morning. The tower cleared him straight in. No traffic. The coral runway at Pioque stretched ahead of him, white and flat in the late morning sun. He dropped the gear, felt the familiar thump of the mains locking into position, lined up on the center of the strip, and brought the Corsair in. The wheels touched. The tail came down. The airplane rolled straight and true on the coral, decelerating, the engine ticking over at idle, the heat pouring off the cowling in visible waves that distorted the palm trees at the far end of the runway. He taxied to his revetment, swung the nose around and cut the mixture. The engine coughed once and stopped. The propeller ticked through 2 final rotations and was still. Plane captain, the same enlisted man who had pulled the chocks and snapped a salute 2 hours and 45 minutes earlier, climbed up on the wing root and looked at Kepford through the open canopy. Neither man spoke. There was nothing in the plane captain's face that suggested he knew what had happened over the Solomon Sea that morning. There was nothing in Kepford's face that suggested he was ready to talk about it. Kepford sat in the cockpit for a long moment. His flight suit was dark with sweat from the collar to the waist. His hands were still on the throttle and the stick, the grip of a man who had been holding on for 20 minutes and had not yet told his body that it was over. He released them deliberately, one finger at a time, unstrapped his harness, pulled off his goggles, and climbed out. The ground crew inspected White 29 that afternoon. Several bullet holes in the aft fuselage, damage to the port elevator, a tear in the trailing edge of the starboard wing, clean punctures where a burst from one of the trailing Zeeks had passed through the fuselage skin behind the cockpit. If those rounds had been 6 inches to the right, they would have hit the pilot. 6 inches. In a fight that lasted 20 minutes, over 150 miles of empty ocean. 6 inches between a man who came home and a man who did not. None of the damage was serious enough to ground the airplane. The Corsair would fly again. Kepford filed his after-action report that evening. He claimed 2 enemy aircraft destroyed. 1 Nakajima A6M2N floatplane. 1 Mitsubishi A6M Zeke fighter, the third Zero. The one that had crashed into the ocean during the low-altitude intercept attempt, he did not claim. He had not fired at it. He had not seen it go in. The report was endorsed that night by the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 17, John Thomas Blackburn, the man who had fought to keep the Corsair when the Navy wanted to take it away. the man who had traded a carrier deck for a coral runway because he believed in an airplane that no one else believed in. His signature on that report closed a circle that had begun 14 months earlier in an office at the Bureau of Aeronautics, where a stubborn lieutenant commander had refused to give up on a rejected fighter. The Silver Star citation came weeks later. The language was formal. Lieutenant Kepford had dauntlessly destroyed an enemy floatplane off Cape Sear, and when attacked by 20 Zeros in an ensuing engagement, had aggressively met the enemy in combat, shooting down one, and safely returning to base. 20 Zeros. 1 Corsair. Those were the numbers in the official record. Fighting Squadron 17 completed its combat tour on the 10th of April, 1944. In 76 days of sustained combat operations from coral airstrips in the Solomon Islands, the squadron was credited with 154 enemy aircraft destroyed, 11 aces. It was the highest score recorded by any United States Navy fighter squadron in a single combat tour for the entire war. The record was never broken. The Corsair did not stay rejected. Royal Navy engineers, working with the same airplane the American Navy had given up on, solved the problems that the Americans could not. A revised oleo valve in the landing gear struts softened the bounce. A small metal wedge, riveted to the leading edge of the starboard wing, cured the asymmetric stall. A curved approach pattern replaced the straight-in approach, giving the pilot a view of the deck all the way to touchdown. By late 1944, F4U Corsairs were landing on American and British carriers across the Pacific. The airplane the Navy had rejected was flying from the Navy's own ships. By the end of the war, Corsairs were credited with 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed, against a loss ratio of better than 11 to 1. 12,571 were built between 1942 and 1953, the longest production run of any piston engine fighter in United States history. The Zero did not get a second chance. 10,939 were built. The pilots who had made the airplane legendary were gone by mid-1944. Dead over Rabaul, dead over the Solomons, dead in the water off the Marianas. The Japanese training system could not replace them. The airplane that had been designed for the most skilled naval aviators in the world ran out of skilled aviators. In the last year of the war, the surviving Zeros were loaded with explosive and flown by young men who had learned to take off but had never been taught to land. The airplane that had conquered the Pacific became, in its final chapter, a weapon that did not need a pilot who could fight. Only one willing to die. When the skilled pilots were gone, one side had nothing left. The other still had an airplane that could bring a man home. Ira Cassius Kepford returned to the United States in April of 1944 with 16 confirmed aerial victories. He was the leading ace of the United States Navy. He held that distinction until the 19th of June, when Lieutenant Alexander Vrasio shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Kepford was transferred to VF-84, a new squadron formed around veterans of VF-17 and commanded by Roger Hedrick, the former executive officer of the WWII. The squadron that had been thrown off a carrier because of the Corsair now had its best pilots leading a new unit back to the fleet. After the war, Kepford left active service. He remained in the Naval Reserve until 1956, retiring as a lieutenant commander. He went home. He took a job as a trainee at a drugstore company. He worked his way up. He became president of the company. He retired in 1960. He rarely spoke about the war. The men who flew with him in VF-17 said he was quiet, matter of fact, uninterested in his own reputation. When reporters called in later years, asking about the 20 zeros, asking about the morning over the Solomon Sea, asking him to describe what it felt like to be alone against 20 enemy fighters in an airplane the Navy did not want. He would answer their questions politely and briefly, and then change the subject. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He did not seem to consider what had happened to him particularly remarkable. He did not write a memoir. He did not appear on television. He did not tell his story at air shows or veterans' conventions. He did not join the lecture circuit or the speaking tour or the autograph table. He lived quietly in Michigan. He had a family. He had children. He had a life that had nothing to do with what had happened over the Solomon Sea on a single morning in February of 1944. Ira Cassius Kepford died on the 19th of January, 1987, in Harbor Springs, Michigan. He was 67 years old. He was buried at Lakeside Cemetery in Muskegon. On the morning of February the 19th, 1944, a rejected airplane and an unknown pilot met 20 Japanese fighters over the Solomon Sea. The Japanese had altitude. They had numbers. They had surprise. The Corsair had speed and armor and an engine that could produce 2,250 horsepower for 5 minutes when a lever on the throttle quadrant was pushed forward. Two design philosophies collided over that empty stretch of ocean. One had sacrificed everything for lightness and range and the ability to turn. The other had sacrificed agility for power and protection, and the ability to take a hit and keep flying. The Corsair did not win because its pilot was braver than the men in the Zeros. It did not win because the Japanese pilots were unskilled or because the Zero was a bad airplane. The Zero was a masterpiece. It had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. It had terrified every Allied air force, from Australia to Alaska. The men who flew it at Rabaul in February of 1944 were the last of a generation of naval aviators who had fought from Pearl Harbor to the Solomon Sea, and they did not lack courage or skill. The Corsair won because on that morning, in that specific set of circumstances, at that altitude, at that speed, over that particular stretch of empty ocean, the engineering decisions made by a team of designers in Stratford, Connecticut, gave its pilot one more option than the engineering decisions made by a team of designers in Nagoya gave theirs. Armor that stopped a bullet 6 inches from the pilot's spine. Fuel tanks that sealed themselves after being hit. An engine that could produce 2,250 horsepower for 5 minutes when a lever was pushed forward. Landing gear strong enough to be thrown into the slipstream at speeds beyond its design limit and long enough to slow the airplane down. One more option. That was the difference between the two airplanes. The airplane the Navy threw away gave its pilot one more chance than the airplane that had conquered the Pacific. And one chance was enough.